Some betrayals leave scars no map can show. Between 1936 and 1944, nearly 500,000 Palestinians lost their homes, their futures, their voices. This is not just a history of conflict, it is a story of erasure, broken promises, and borders drawn without consent. In this deep dive, I will uncover the truth behind the silence, how imperial powers carved the land, how resistance was crushed and redefined as rebellion, and how the seeds of displacement were sown long before the Nakba. Through Prottayon, I seek to reclaim lost memory, restore dignity, and listen to the voices too often ignored. What forces made this early fracture inevitable when decisions by distant powers shaped the lives of millions? When aristocrats and empires drew borders without consent, leaving civilians to bear the cost? And how did these choices set the stage for the events that would follow? This is the path before the fall. Event 1, 1936 to 1939, the Great Palestinian Revolt. By 1936, 2 decades of broken promises had turned into broken lives. Palestinians watched their lands slip away, sold, seized, renamed. The British Mandate, once spoken of in lofty ideals, had become an instrument of their displacement. When the strike began, it was not just against colonial rule, it was against the slow erasure of a people who refused to disappear. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration pledging support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine without consulting its Arab-majority population under British Mandate policies. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Zionist immigration was steadily facilitated and land purchases by Zionist organizations displaced thousands of Palestinian Arab tenant farmers. By the mid-1930s, intensified Jewish immigration, driven in part by the rise of Nazism in Europe, worsened economic inequalities, creating a Palestinian Arab society marked by widespread unemployment, rural landlessness, and mounting resentment. In November 1935, the death of Sheikh Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, a popular preacher and anti-colonial militant at the hands of British forces, became a rallying point for nationalist sentiment. His martyrdom triggered a widespread sense that political grievances could no longer be contained within legal frameworks. In April 1936, a 6-month general strike was launched in Nablus, rapidly spreading across Palestine. Organized by the newly formed Arab Higher Committee under Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the strike demanded an end to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales to Zionist organizations, and the establishment of Palestinian self-rule. British authorities responded with martial law, curfews, mass arrests, and violent suppression of protests. By mid-1936, after the British rejected Palestinian demands and continued suppressive measures, the movement evolved into armed rebellion. Guerrilla warfare intensified between 1938 and 1939, with Palestinian fighters, often rural villagers familiar with the terrain, mounting attacks on British military targets, transportation networks and Zionist settlements. The British response was brutal. Collective punishment policies were systematically implemented, homes demolished, villages razed, curfews enforced, and entire communities fined for suspected support of the rebellion. Notably, the destruction of Al-Bassa village in 1938, where British forces reportedly massacred dozens of civilians, stands as one of the revolt's most infamous atrocities. In suppressing the revolt, the British formed joint operations with Zionist paramilitary forces. The Special Night Squads, commanded by British officer Ord Wingate, combined British soldiers and members of the Haganah, the primary Zionist militia. The Haganah also provided intelligence, guided patrols, and participated in raids against Palestinian fighters and communities. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 wounded, and over 5,600 imprisoned. British forces suffered around 262 fatalities. Zionist communities recorded approximately 91 deaths during the conflict. In addition to the immediate loss of life, hundreds of villages were severely damaged or depopulated, and the political leadership of the Palestinian national movement was effectively dismantled through mass arrests, deportations, and exile. Arab governments across the region expressed rhetorical support for the Palestinian cause but provided minimal material aid. Within Britain, a minority of parliament members and segments of the press criticised the harshness of the counterinsurgency. But the dominant framing characterised Palestinian resistance as lawlessness to justify continued imperial control. By 1939, the revolt had been crushed. Palestinian society emerged devastated, politically fragmented, socially traumatized, and militarily weakened. Britain, concluding that the mandate was becoming untenable in its current form, began exploring political solutions to the Palestine question. The seeds of partition and deeper betrayals had been sown. When a revolt is crushed, the world often tells the wounded to be silent. But memory is not so easily erased. In the ashes of rebellion, new maps were already being drawn, maps that would decide borders, lives and futures, without the consent of those who lived them. As one chapter of defiance closed, another, shaped by diplomacy and division, quietly opened. Event 2, 1937, the Peel Commission. When a rebellion shakes an empire, justice could be the answer, but for Britain, Palestine's cries were answered not with listening, but with lines on a map. In 1937, the Peel Commission arrived with a single question dressed as fairness. How do you divide a land that does not belong to you? In response to the 1936 Arab Revolt, Britain established the Peel Commission, a royal inquiry tasked with investigating the roots of the uprising and proposing a solution for Palestine's future. But, from the outset, the inquiry reflected imperial assumptions. British rule and Zionist settlement were treated as givens. The question was not if the land should be divided, but how. Chaired by Lord William Peel, the commission included only British officials. Palestinian and Arab voices were systematically sidelined. Most Palestinian leaders, sensing the futility of the process, boycotted the hearings altogether. In contrast, Zionist leaders, including Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, seized the moment, delivering polished testimony and organising site visits to showcase the issue of development. Their engagement shaped the narrative Britain would soon adopt. After touring the region and consulting selectively, the Peel Commission released its report in July 1937. It concluded that the mandate had become unworkable, a tacit admission that Britain's colonial model had failed. The core recommendation was dramatic: partition Palestine into two separate states, one Arab, one Jewish, with an international zone around Jerusalem. The proposed Jewish state would span nearly 20% of Palestine, despite Jews making up only about 30% of the population and owning less than 7% of the land. The plan also endorsed, in chillingly vague terms, the transfer of over 225,000 Arabs from the proposed Jewish state, a euphemism that quietly seeded the logic of ethnic cleansing. Zionist responses were mixed, but strategic. The Jewish agency accepted the plan as a starting point. Ben-Gurion later admitted, after the formation of a large force following the establishment of the state, we will abolish the partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. Revisionist Zionists, led by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, rejected the proposal outright, demanding more territory and opposing any limits on Jewish expansion. Palestinian and Arab reactions were immediate and unequivocal. The Arab Higher Committee condemned the plan as a colonial betrayal. They rejected any partition of Palestine, a land where Arabs were the majority and whose future, they insisted, should be decided by its indigenous people. Just 2 months later, 21 Arab delegates from across the region gathered at the Bludan Conference in Syria and unanimously denounced the Peel Plan, calling instead for full and undivided independence. While a minority of British officials expressed concern over the injustice of partition, the dominant framing within London treated Palestine as a strategic burden to be resolved, not a people to be heard. The Peel Report quietly introduced a new logic into international discourse, that Palestine could be solved by drawing borders without Palestinian consent. Though the plan was never implemented, its consequences were lasting. Arab resistance escalated, British repression intensified, and the idea of partition, once fringe, began gaining traction in Western policy circles. The seed had been planted, that dispossession could be reframed as compromise, that borders could be inked without rights. Maps are made with pens, but lives are written in blood, in runes, in names. In 1937, Palestine was redrawn without its people's consent, a warning that would soon grow louder. When memory is broken into pieces, injustice finds its foothold. Event 3, 1939, the British White Paper. By 1939, Britain had stopped pretending to offer Palestine freedom. All that remained was management, cold, calculated and crumbling. The British White Paper wasn't a bridge to justice, it was a scaffold built on broken ground. By the late 1930s, the British Empire was entangled in a conflict of its own making. The Great Palestinian Revolt, 1936 to 1939, had shattered any illusion of stable colonial rule. Britain responded with force, deploying over 20,000 troops, flattening villages and imprisoning thousands without trial. But as tensions rose in Europe, Britain's focus shifted. With war looming, they couldn't afford unrest in the Middle East. not with the Suez Canal and vital oil routes at stake. The Peel Commission of 1937 had proposed partitioning Palestine, but the plan collapsed under Arab resistance and British indecision. Now, Britain needed a quick fix, a policy to placate Arab leaders without entirely alienating the Zionist movement. On May 17, 1939, Britain issued the White Paper, marking a sharp reversal from the Balfour Declaration's promise of a Jewish national home. Key points included a path to independence, a promise that Palestine would achieve full independence within 10 years, by 1949, as a unified state where Arabs and Jews would share power. But this independence was conditional, hinging on the development of self-governing institutions, a vague requirement leaving the timeline open to British discretion. Jewish immigration limits, capping Jewish immigration at 75,000 over the next 5 years, just 15,000 annually. After that, further immigration would require Arab consent, effectively granting the Arab majority a veto. This was a devastating blow to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. Stephen S. Wise, an American Zionist leader, protested. To place a veto in the hands of those who have sworn to destroy us is an act of political cynicism unparalleled in our times. Land restrictions, severe limitations on Jewish land purchases, banning them outright in about 95% of Palestine through the 1940 land transfer regulations. Intended to preserve the Arab majority, this move effectively froze Jewish territorial expansion. Zionist leaders reacted with fury. David Ben-Gurion declared, "We shall fight the White Paper as if there is no war, and fight the war as if there is no White Paper," a pledge symbolizing the strategy of resisting British rule while supporting the Allied war effort. The Jewish Agency mobilized to undermine the policy. Underground networks expanded their Aliyah Bet operations, smuggling tens of thousands of Jews into Palestine, defying British naval blockades. Groups like the Haganah, Irgun and Lehi intensified armed resistance, laying the groundwork for a full-scale insurgency. Palestinian Arab reactions were complex. Some welcomed the restriction on Jewish immigration, but others saw the White Paper as a half measure failing to deliver true independence. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, condemned it as another British betrayal, stating that Palestine's Arab majority would never accept a policy that continued to recognize Zionist claims. For Palestinians in the hills around Jaffa, the White Paper felt like another foreign decree, written without their voices. For Jewish refugees trapped in Europe, it was a final bureaucratic barrier, a line on a map that closed the last door to safety. In Jerusalem's markets, conversations grew quieter, eyes more watchful. In Europe's refugee camps, letters stopped coming. By the late 1930s, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees found themselves stranded, unable to find sanctuary as the walls of Europe closed in. Ships like the St. Louis, carrying desperate families, were turned away from one port after another, sent back to face the horrors they had tried to escape. The pressure kept building. Britain had promised order, but the cracks were already showing. The White Paper was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it lit the fuse for the next one. Promises made by empires aren't carved in stone. They're scrawled in sand, blown away when the storm rolls in. In Palestine, the ink of compromise dried fast, but the cracks spread faster. Event 4, 1944, the assassination of Lord Moyne. Some wars are fought with declarations, others with bullets in broad daylight, in alleyways, in silence that says more than speeches ever could. In 1944, a single moment in Cairo cut through the noise and changed what was left of diplomacy in Palestine. Lord Walter Guinness, better known as Lord Moyne, was a senior British official, Churchill's man in the Middle East. From Cairo, he had the final say on what happened across the region, including in Palestine. To a small but radical Zionist group called Lehi, known by the British as the Stern Gang, Moyne wasn't just another diplomat. He was a symbol of British betrayal, the man who helped enforce the 1939 White Paper, the policy that shut the doors to Jewish refugees, even as the Nazis were wiping them out. Lehi didn't buy into the idea of waiting. They weren't interested in negotiations. Unlike the mainstream Zionist leaders who were working with Britain during the war, Lehi saw the British Empire as the real problem. To them, Palestine was occupied, and force, not talk, was the only way out. What pushed them over the edge? One speech stood out. In 1942, Moyne stood in the House of Lords and said Arabs were a pure race, and that Jewish people were a mixed race. That line stuck. Lehi pointed to it as proof. This empire wasn't neutral, it was racist, and it was choosing sides. They also never forgot the Struma disaster. 768 Jewish refugees left to die at sea after being denied entry to Palestine. Lehi's rage wasn't just about ships or speeches. It reached back to 1938, when 32 nations gathered at Evian to address the growing crisis of Jewish refugees. One by one, they offered sympathy, then turned their backs. Britain refused to open Palestine. America offered platitudes, not visas. Only the Dominican Republic agreed to take more than a token few. For Lehi, Evian became proof that the world had no intention of saving the Jews, and that only armed struggle in Palestine could force a homeland into existence. If no other nation would have them, they would take one, with blood if they had to. To Lehi, this wasn't politics anymore, it was personal. On 6 November 1944, two young Lehi members, Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Bet-Zuri, waited outside Moyne's home in Cairo. When his car pulled up, they didn't hesitate. Hakim fired 3 shots. Bet-Zuri shot and killed Moyne's driver, Lance Corporal Arthur Fuller. Moyne was taken to hospital, but he didn't make it. They tried to cycle off, but locals stepped in. Police caught them almost immediately. Both were put on trial, sentenced to death, and hanged in March 1945. Years later, in 1975, their bodies were returned to Israel. They were buried with full military honours. Lehi called them heroes. But most Jewish leaders, including Ben-Gurion and the Jewish Agency, didn't agree. They called it a horrific crime, a blow to the movement, and a gift to the British press. Jewish communities in Palestine and across Europe were just trying to survive. This didn't help, it hurt. But Lehi put out leaflets anyway. They called Moyne a murderer. They claimed, though it's never been confirmed, that he once responded to a proposal to save Hungarian Jews by saying, "Where can I put them?" Even if it wasn't true, people believed it, and in that moment, it spread. The Arab world didn't stay quiet either. Newspapers across the region, from Al-Ahram to Philistine, pointed to the killing as proof of Zionist militancy, settler ambition, and a clear sign that the partition of Palestine wasn't going to be peaceful. And for Britain, it was a mess. Churchill was furious, but even he admitted that it shook British control in Palestine. Still, the policies didn't change. Refugee ships kept getting turned back, even gunfire couldn't open the gates. The assassination of Lord Moyne became a symbol, not just of rebellion, but of what happens when diplomacy collapses, when colonial power holds on too tight, and radicalism pushes back. Palestinian communities faced the fallout. Jewish refugees remained trapped, their trauma used and twisted by those in power, both peoples, caught between the maps of empire and the ambitions of men. When words are ignored, violence steps in. While the world watched Europe's war, in Palestine, something else was building. The silence after Moyne's fall would not last long. This episode revealed how broken promises and silent betrayals fractured Palestine long before 1948. It showed how millions lost their homes and voices while powerful empires drew borders without consent. But this is only the beginning of the story. In the next episode, we'll examine how the world's leaders decided Palestine's fate, how Holocaust survivors sought refuge, and how the plan to partition the land unfolded. To support justice for Palestinians, stay informed, share what you learn, and raise the voices too often ignored. For trustworthy information, consider these sources: The Iron Cage by Rashid Khalidi, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Elam Pape, United Nations Archives on the Mandate and Partition Plans, writings of Hannah Arendt, and Essays and Letters by Albert Einstein. It is important to understand, Zionism as a political movement does not represent Judaism or Jewish people as a whole. No hatred should be directed towards Jewish communities, but rather towards colonialist and Zionist policies that have caused suffering. If this episode helped you see Palestine's history more clearly, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support allows this work to continue, telling truths that matter. Join the conversation in the comments. Your voice is important here. Thank you for watching Prottayon, where truth is remembered and dignity restored. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the stories that matter. And most importantly, take care.